thank you to folks who've been putting your information in the chat box. Please keep doing that. I have never done this before where I can't see you, and so this is a whole new experience for me. So I need you to be in the chat box so that I know that you're there and that you're, yeah, I need some moral support this morning. For those of you who didn't hear, didn't have any coffee this morning, so you are my coffee. So if you have not already, put your name, your pronouns, and where you're coming in from today. We would love to hear from you and hear a little bit more about your background. So while you do that, I'll walk you through today's agenda. So I am going to do a little bit of conversation about personal stories. Personal stories are one of the tools that we use always in our work, and they're really, really useful tools for everything, but they also are really important tools for both legislative and electoral advocacy. And so I want to make sure that we get some conversation about that. Andrea, thank you for your support. I think if I left to go get coffee now, that would probably be ill-timed, but I appreciate it. After we talk about personal stories, I'm going to do a little bit of conversation about the tools for our time and the things that you can be using and doing now in this new world that we're living in. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what's at stake, and then I'll give you some tactics for taking action. I'll just warn you that the presentation that we had planned to give, this presentation is a little different. We are, as you well know, living through completely new worlds that none of us have ever seen before, and that's true in so many ways. And so I want to make sure that I am being mindful and respectful of that, and I didn't want to just give you what we typically do, because what we typically do is not totally useful in this moment. And there are some things that we always do that will work in this world, and there are some things that won't. And so I do want to make sure that this presentation is helpful for you and that you get what you need from it. And so if at any point there's something that you have a question about or that you want to know more about, don't hesitate to jump in the chat box and let us know. We also have a Q&A that you'll see at the bottom. There's a little chat feature, and then there's also a Q&A feature. And so for the things that I'm asking you about, check in about where you're coming from, or if we do other checking questions later on, that stuff, putting it into the chat box is great, because then other folks can see it too. If you have a question that you want to make sure doesn't get lost in the fray, putting it in the Q&A section sends it right to me, Justin, Michelle, so we can check it out, make sure that we get your questions answered. But I will keep a close eye on both of those things. So thank you to all the folks who have checked in. Hi, Brianna. Hi, Dan. Hi, Andrea. Hi, Marnie. Hi, Alex. So great to have you all. All right, so on our next slide, we are going to jump into our framework for today. So this framework is stolen, lovingly, from a really smart guy named Marshall Gans, who set up this framework as a way to think about our work. And so I love it. I use it all the time, and I think you'll find it helpful too. I hope you'll find it helpful too. So our framework is our story of self, our story of us, and our story of now. And what this means is, in order to have a holistic approach to our work, we need to have a good lock on all of these things. And so your story of self is, pretty obvious, making sure that you're taking care of yourself, that you understand your motivations, that you understand what drives you. And that will help you to understand both the work that you will be most passionate and most effective in. It's also that tool of your personal story that I started to talk to you all about. And it will help you to help motivate others to come along with you. Speaking of bringing along other folks with you, our story of us is that conversation about the community of people that are doing the work and the way that we're doing it. And that has always been important to our work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while, but especially now, especially in the time that we're living in, that story of us is so crucial. And so we're going to really dig in there a little bit today. And then the story of now is really the space that you take action in. It's making sure that you understand our context, that you understand what actions are available to you, what will make the most sense, how to prioritize the things that you can do. And so all of these pieces are so important to having as I said, a full picture of your advocacy, but you need to dig into each of these spots in order to be your most effective. Any questions about that? Does that make sense to folks? I hope it does. If you have any questions, shoot them in the Q&A. I promise to slow down, turn around, go back, whatever it is that you all need. So your story of self, I told you that personal stories are so very important in our work, but it's also really, really important right now as we are mostly socially distancing, as we are in a place of pretty serious protest and turmoil in our country over racial injustice and long-standing anti-Blackness in our country, and your place in that, um, your personal narrative and also your well-being are so important to your advocacy. You cannot last the test of time in this work before you've taken care of and understood your part in it. And so I think this is a really important place to start. And I am going to ask you to check in again, because one of the things that I've learned in working through COVID is that it's very, very important for us to be checking in with each other about how we're doing and where we are. And knowing that information really helps us to ground the conversations that we have and the work that we do. So the way that we do check-ins at HRC is we do a personal number and then we do a political number, which for us usually means a professional number. So a personal number is, how are you feeling? Just in your life, in your personal world, how are things going for you? And then your political or your professional number has more to do with, how are you feeling in your social justice space, in your advocacy space. So we use a scale from 1 to 10. 1 is the worst day ever. 10 is the best day ever. And I will model for you. So for me today, I would say I'm a 7 personally. I am feeling pretty good despite all the things that are happening around me. I'm still very nervous for all of my people all around the country who are out and about and on the streets and making their voices heard through direct action. And I'm pretty well rested, I'm feeling pretty good. So I'm going to say a 7. And then from a professional or a political space, I would say I'm a lot closer to a 5. The work is very different than it has been in the past, and we are working really hard to try and adapt, and it's a hard time to work extra hard. So if you want to jump in the chat box and give us your numbers, how are you feeling personally? How are you feeling politically? That'll help me to figure out our collective headspace and sort of how to talk to you all in a way that will feel good and get you what you need. In the meantime, Andrea has asked if folks would select all panelists and attendees in the chat box. So if you want to send out so that everyone can hear you, you need to select all panelists and attendees so everybody can hear it. There have been a lot of those comments that have come to just the panelists. So I can see them, but not everybody else can. And we want to make sure that you can all see each other's feedback too. Okay, so on the next slide, I'm going to talk just a little bit more about the power of personal stories and how we came to find it. So as we were working towards marriage equality was really when this became just an enormous part of our work. For years and years and years, we had really focused on trying to depersonalize our work and make it less focused on the human aspect of our work and a little bit more focused on rights and legality and trying to have sort of a head conversation about queer folks. And then we were losing a ton. And what we noticed was that our opposition was almost always talking from a gut space, or a heart space, but mostly from a place of fear. They were using a lot of fear tactics to scare people about what it meant to be a queer person and what it meant to give queer people the same access and support as other folks. And so we tried something different. We tried actually really leaning into personal stories and trying to find ways to use them as a tool for prejudice reduction, for changing folks' minds, for laying a base so that when our opposition came in with those fear tactics, we could have something there that folks could call upon so they knew that queer folks weren't, this sort of scary other. And it worked. It worked at an incredible rate. I worked on the Minnesota campaign for marriage, and when we called people, we were just cold calling strangers, and still 1 out of every 4 conversations when we were just telling our stories and talking about why marriage was important to us and talking about why it was the basis of our families and why it was a recognition of love and what it meant to us to be able to have it, we were able to change folks' minds who weren't with us at the start of the call 1 in every 4 times, which is incredible. That is an incredible success rate, and nothing like the other conversations that we'd had, or the sort of debate style of changing folks' minds. And so that was really when we came to understand and appreciate the power of personal stories. We also know that as we're working for greater protections for trans folks, that there just aren't enough people yet who know and love someone who's trans. And so telling your story, if you are, like me, a person of trans experience, is so important to humanizing trans people and getting us moving forward. And so we use personal stories, like I said, in all of the work that we do, electoral work, legislative work, in our campaigns, our ad campaigns. We use it when we're recruiting new people to the movement. They are such an important tool. And so I really encourage you to lean in here and really think through your own story. I'm also going to ask you, if you can, to pull out a piece of paper so that you can make some notes for yourself, because we're going to go through a lot in the next little bit. I'm going to start moving pretty quickly here. And so for you to have some tools for yourself moving forward, it would be great if there were some things that you could jot down. So first, if you jot down story of self, we're going to now start working on your own personal story. And so I will actually, Justin, do you want to tell your personal story? Do you want to give a little model for folks?
Yeah. So story I usually say is, I was born in Michigan, and I, had started different feelings like, attraction to other boys in my classes. But my family was supportive when I told them, but I wasn't personally ready to really come out until after college. And it wasn't until I moved to Chicago and found community and people like me that it really mattered, and it was the right time. And once I was out, I was just full. And so I started getting involved in the marriage equality movement right away. And I think a big part of that was just the community, the support that I had. And it's just so important, and having role models, people that we can look to. And it just makes all the difference when you're trying to advocate for an improvement in acknowledging rights that are inherent. So I think that, like Lindsay was touching on, the stories really do move the needle in helping people realize that what we're fighting for is important.
Thanks, Justin. That was great. And I think a pretty common story for folks that folks will tell is a coming out story, and sort of the background of what that was like. And these are experiences that folks that don't have them can't fully understand unless you open up and share them and show them what it's like to be us. Just a couple of top lines. So one thing is that there are 2 kinds of stories that we use most often when we're crafting our stories. One is called a harm story, and one is called a journey story. So a harm story is a story where you talk about something that happened to you that can help folks to empathize and sort of understand your experience. So for me, the story that I tell most often is about my awakening, my political awakening around queerness was because there was a marriage amendment on the ballot when I was early in high school. And it was the first time that my small community in Ohio had ever talked about queer folks in front of me. And basically it was already illegal to be married as same-sex couples. But we were voting on whether or not to actually write that into the Ohio Constitution. And that happens in dozens of states across the country. And the conversations were hard to hear, but what was harder was waking up after Election Day and having, I think the number was 62% of my state voted that not only should I not have the same rights as other folks, but it was so important to them that it should be constitutional. And that just devastated me. And so, yeah, I think that's one example of a harm story. A journey story is a story of how you came to understand something that you didn't understand before. And so the journey stories that we hear most often in our work are usually allies, maybe parents who at first weren't, fully on a path of allyship, and then they were able to change their minds. And these stories are as important because they help to carve a path for folks to changing their own minds. And so showing people that it's okay to not be all the way there yet on our issues, but that there is a path forward and that there is a way for them to move towards allyship is really important. So as you're trying to find and frame your own story, I would encourage you to think through those two things, thinking through, do I have stories of harm or of journey that could help me in my advocacy, whether that's on queer issues or whether that's on other things. But trying to peg your story and get it worked out is really important. Now, this is a lot harder than the other things I've asked you to put in the chat box, but if you're comfortable sharing your why, sharing what it is that drives you in this work or what it is that motivates you to do this work, even when you're tired or, something like a global pandemic is happening in the background, I would love to hear your stories. Typically, we would now break out and folks would get to share their stories, but we can't do that today. So if you are comfortable sharing your story in the chat box and modeling for other folks what that might look like, I will love you forever. So you have that promise from me. I'll also just say one more thing about framing your story, which is that when we use it, particularly when we're talking to folks who are not all the way there, or their views are opposed to our own, it's really important to pay attention to your language and recognize that more liberal minds and conservative minds tend to have different value sets, just in terms of the language that we use. But it's not that our values aren't aligned, it's just that our language is different. So even things like rights or equality, those aren't values that resonate with conservative minds as much as they do with liberal minds, but things like fairness or protections do. And we're talking about the same stuff, but just shifting your language just a tiny bit will make it so that folks can hear you a little bit better. And that's important for finding and framing your story as well. So I hope on your piece of paper now, you're starting to sketch out what your story might be. You'll also start to realize that you have lots of stories, and that's great. You should have an arsenal of stories that you can use in your advocacy. And so I encourage you to really dig in and try to find as much as you can that you can use as we move forward. All right, on the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ways that we use stories. So I talked about things like volunteer recruitment. I talked about things like, ad campaigns or videos, things like that. But stories are also really important for both electoral and legislative advocacy in a number of ways. So when we do our electoral work, often what we're trying to do is either bring folks along on a candidate or issue or get folks out to vote. Those are usually the two things that we're trying to do. And both of those things require motivating folks and helping them to understand why those actions are important. And not just why they would be important for other people, but why they would be important for you. And one of the really important things about story sharing is that then instead of getting into a debate, you're modeling a dialogue of digging deeper. And often when you share your story, other folks will share their story back. And in saying their story out loud, they are realizing their own motivations. They're realizing why it's important to them. And so we use our stories every time we do either get out the vote or persuasion work in electoral work. And we do the same thing with legislative work. In legislative campaigning, if you are seeking to try to change a legislator's mind on something, then telling your story either through phone calls or letters or emails or through lobby visits is super important. And we have a National Lobby Day that we host every year. And folks always, their instinct is that they want to go in like a professional lobbyist and talk about the bills and the language of the bills and the legality issues, and it's a bad instinct. The best thing that you can do if you are one-on-one with a legislator or a staff member for a legislator, is to tell your story and to talk about why this legislation has a human element, why there are people that this matters to, and that this person is looking at someone that it matters to. It humanizes our issues. It makes this so much easier for folks to connect across distance. And so as you're thinking through your advocacy work, I encourage you to look for spots that this might help, places where this might be useful, and use your stories as much as you possibly can. I think once you start looking for it, you're going to find all kinds of places where these can be helpful. And so I encourage you to do that and to look through it. I think that's everything I have to say about the story of self. So if you have questions about any of that, don't forget to drop them in the Q&A box, and I will circle back or make sure to get those answered.
Just to add on to what Lindsay was talking about, as someone who's been part of the lobby days, it's so true. Yeah, once you kind of have that human connection with the staff member or the elected official, it really makes a difference, and you can even build on that relationship, so it's not just a one-time meeting, but you can stay in touch with them and just always being visible, letting them know that you're there, really makes a difference, especially now that I actually work for an elected official. And during his primary, he won by 12 votes. So just the power of like a vote really does matter.
Votes matter, y'all. Votes matter, in case that wasn't clear. All right, so let's talk about the story of us. So again, once you've found your own personal motivation, it's time for you to collect your crew and figure out how you're going to pull together a group of people to do this work. And the story of us, as I said, has always been important, but it's specifically important now. And one of the tactics that comes out of a good understanding of the story of us is called relational organizing. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to that now. So relational organizing just means that instead of calling a stranger, instead of knocking on someone's door that you don't know, instead you really focus on the people that you already have relationships to and try to figure out how you can leverage those relationships in a way that pushes the work forward. And this is something that we've done forever, but now we have real data on it, and we have a situation that really calls for it. This is a really, for people who aren't data focused, this graph can freak you out a little bit. What you need to know is just that relational organizing is all the way on the right. It's circled in red. You can see how much more effective relational organizing is than any other tactic that we use. And relational organizing could look like you're just, you're calling 3 people that you know and making sure that they get out to vote. Or it might be that you are calling 3 people that you know and encouraging them to come and do this work with you. But again, relational organizing just means that instead of hearing these messages from someone that they don't know or they don't trust or don't have a relationship to, folks are hearing these messages from people that they do know and do respect and do trust. And on the next slide, you can see that not only is this more effective for everyone, but it's wildly more effective for some of the groups of people that we really have trouble motivating, either to vote or to come along with us. And so, as you saw in the last graph, it's 2 times more effective than all of our other outreach, but it's also 6 times more effective with our low propensity voters, or the people that aren't as likely to go out and vote without a little push. 7 times more effective with millennials, which is not our youngest category of voters anymore, but it's the category we have information for. And 8 times more effective for voters of color. And as you know, all of these groups of folks are really, really important to get civically engaged, but they are also specifically important to get civically engaged right now. And there are lots of reasons why that's going to be harder in this election than it ever has been before. On the next slide.
For anyone that's been a part of a phone bank before, like, not as many people answer their phones nowadays. So, the odds of someone picking up and having a conversation are maybe 1 in 10. But yeah, like this data shows, the more one-on-one points can be much more effective.
Yeah, my mom is a lot less likely to ignore my call, which is important. But so to my previous point, this is super important now I can't know exactly what your experience has been of COVID, but I do know that for many, many, many of the people that I have spoken to, you're not getting outside of your usual networks as much as you used to. You're not meeting new people as much as you used to. You don't have as much energy for building new relationships as you used to. A lot of folks are really focused on how do I maintain the relationships that mean the most to me, and then everything else they're just way too tired to do. And so, as you're thinking through how you can do this work and how you can apply relational organizing to your work, these are three prompts that I would encourage you to think through right now. So, again, on your little piece of paper, make a little spot for this. But what we're trying to come up with is three people in your networks that maybe you need to have a tough conversation with. Typically, what this means in our work is, are there folks who are not all the way there in their queer allyship? But as you're very aware, in this moment, we are having really, really complicated conversations about race with folks who've just woken up to racial injustice for the first time. And that may sound bananas to folks of color because folks of color know that this has been happening forever. But there are a lot of folks who are on the scene for the first time ever, and they really need some guidance about how to get engaged with this work in a way that doesn't re-traumatize all of the folks of color who are already really going through it right now. And so one of the most important things that you can be doing is thinking through, everybody's got a racist uncle. How can you have a one-on-one conversation with your racist uncle about what's happening in our country right now, why it's important to you, and what personal stories do you have to share that might change his mind about these things, or at least get him thinking about things in a different way. It may take a whole host of conversations to change someone's mind, but getting people thinking about things differently only takes one conversation. So who are those three folks? Then who are three people in your network that might not vote unless you really poked them about it? Everybody has these folks too. We know that the queer community and equality voters, or the voters that support queer folks, are more likely to vote than the rest of the population. But there are still lots of folks, particularly in those groups that we were talking about, the very young, folks of color, folks who are in a lower socioeconomic status, folks particularly who are going through unemployment right now. All of those factors lead to a drop in your voting propensity. And so who are the three people in your network that you could make a plan to vote with and that you could follow up with to make sure that they're going to go out and vote? And then the last is, who are the three people in your networks who would join you in doing more? So as you're building out your plan for advocacy and figuring out how you're going to move forward in the work, who are the three folks that you could encourage to join with you? So we have a question in the chat box, and the question is, do you know how the pandemic has affected LGBTQ advocacy and voting? For instance, is outreach still impacting people and they'll opt to do mail-in voting if they don't want to go out, or is everyone in general less likely to vote? So we actually are going to get into this a little bit with some slides in a second, and so I'll do that first, and then I will return to the screen, I promise. I will come back and answer this in more depth, but I just wanted you to know that I see it. So the transition to get us there is that we are now going to start talking about the story of now. And the story of now, again, is really complicated. So what's at stake now is different than anything that we've ever seen in the past. On the next slide, you'll see my small attempt to show you in clip art what's at stake. But we've got a whole host of stuff happening all at once that is completely unprecedented. This pandemic we've never organized in anything like this. I've never organized in anything like this. The situation at our highest levels of government and the weight of this election and just how important this election is for our future. Every election, you'll hear people say this is the most important election you'll ever vote in. This time it's true. It's not just a tactic. It's not just something that we're saying. This is the most important election of your lifetime. And so, and that's obviously completely new. And then this moment of awakening for our country and conversation in our country about racial injustice, again, is more widespread and lasting longer than anything that we've seen like this in the past. We've had massive protests about racial injustice in the past, but never before has it been so global. Never before has it lasted for so many days. Never before have people shown up in a space where it is physically unsafe to do it, and yet the whole world is showing up for it. And so the stakes are just really high. So we're going to get to your question. So what we know is that we were trending towards enthusiasm like we had never seen before for this election, and now it's dropping. And you can see that it is dropping right along in line with the turn of this year. And it's COVID. It has so much to do with the fact that folks are really having to change in their hierarchy of needs what they're most focused on. And this is not what we want. We do not want a low enthusiasm turnout in November, because we're going to need turnout like we've never seen before in order to make the changes that we need to make. And so trying to combat this is really important. On the next slide, you'll also see that in addition to the general enthusiasm issue, we do have major safety concerns. We're seeing major safety concerns from a number of folks about showing up to vote. You're also seeing some really bad behavior on the part of the folks who make the laws around voting access. And we just saw this in Georgia yesterday. Those bad behaviors are targeted. They are very targeted at the voters that those bad behaving legislators do not want to see show up to the polls. I have seen so many side-by-sides of lines and lines and lines of people waiting to vote in predominantly neighborhoods of color, while the more upper class white neighborhoods have no lines at their voting places. And that's very purposeful. And so as we talk about the health impacts of turnout, having people have to stand in line, having people have to wait in an enclosed space, not only is it not safe, but folks know it's not safe. And so that is a major impact on turnout and voting. And we also, as I said, are in this moment where folks are turning out in droves in the streets to try and make changes to the institutions and general oppressions of our society. And that also shifts people's understanding of what is important in this moment. We are 5 months out from an election, and we haven't been able to talk about the election almost at all the way that we typically would, because there's so much other stuff that we need to focus on and that is so important. Another thing that we're thinking through right now is that we just don't know what's going to happen with COVID. There are a lot of states and a lot of places that are treating this like it's over, but we know that that's not true. And so, trying to figure out how we approach this election when there's so much unknown is really rough. And so let's talk about the plan. Let's talk about what we're going to do. So Sharina, to your question about outreach and mail-in voting and all of that, what we know about our electoral work for this year is that it's going to be tough, because not only is voting access so important, but the voting access laws are moving and changing and shifting so quickly, and that lives at a lower level of governance than we typically advocate or engage with. There are ways that we can engage in electoral work, legislative work, and direct action work to try and get done this year what we need to get done. But in all of these areas, I encourage you to really focus on your personal spot in it and your community spot in it in order to be most effective. So first, starting with electoral work, this is sort of an old photo of me pre-beard, so excuse that. But this is from 2018 when we were doing work on a campaign in Kansas. And this is Sharice Davids. Sharice Davids is a queer woman of color who is running for a congressional seat in Kansas. And I think no one in the world, when she started that race, thought that she had a chance. But what Sharice's campaign did better than any other campaign I've seen was build a community around it, really get folks connected to each other in working for her campaign. And she told her story as a Native American woman, as a queer woman, as someone who was a relative newcomer to politics. She was consistently telling her story and meeting voters, and they were meeting her. And she became a galvanizing force that not only got her elected, but changed the governor's office in Kansas as well. And so, again, really thinking through, how do we make this personal? How do we make this about relationships and connection? That's going to be more important in this election than ever before. And really leaning on your relationships. like I said before, things like phone banking that we used to do so much of, they don't work as well as they used to. And so it's really important to be thinking through your electoral strategy in terms of your relationships. And then lastly, the direct action piece of the work that we're doing right now, it is so important. It is so important that folks be showing their support for the work that is happening and their discontent. We've seen protests happen around everything from what's happening at the border to the broader like Muslim ban that happened. We saw protests happen around the women's movements and some of the anti-choice work that we've seen happen. We've seen protests over gun violence. Now we're seeing these incredible protests around racial injustice. And all of that is super important in terms of galvanizing folks and increasing enthusiasm. And so as dangerous as it is so important for connection and for helping folks to understand the importance of this moment that we continue to lean into all of these strategies for moving our work forward. Yeah, so what can you do right now? Okay, so first up, we've got something that we're doing that's called Team. So Team is an app that we are using to try and push forward relational organizing. And basically what Team does is it formalizes what we're talking about. So when you get into Team, when you join into Team, it allows you to access your contacts and send messages or content to your contacts so that you are doing outreach to people that you already know. So instead of a phone bank where we would give you a list of strangers, if you go into Team, we upload a list of the people that we think we need to talk to, and it checks it against your contact lists and tells you who are the people in your network who statistically are least likely to vote or who are in places where they need extra information about voting. We can't see your contact list. We don't have access to it. It's completely secure. Only you can do this outreach, but this is our way to try and organize this outreach and try to get, as we said, that community of people joined together to do this work as we turn this corner and start to do our work towards 2020. You can scan this with your camera if you'd like. You can also go to this website. I'll make sure that it also gets put into the chat for you all so that you have it. Our next thing is Operation Swing State. This is an initiative that we are running to make sure that folks in the key places for Senate races, for the presidential race, are getting extra touches, especially as I've talked about, because phone calls are less effective now than they used to be. It's really important that we prioritize the folks that need to hear from us and that we put our effort into those spots. And so if you live in a place like Illinois that is unlikely to have as much of that work happening, it's really important to get engaged in other ways with our work. And the last thing is that we're having an event on June 28th. Justin, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Sure. And yeah, just on the Operation Swing State, I think that a lot of us in Illinois are very cognizant of how much we can impact in neighboring states. We're so close to Wisconsin, we're so close to Michigan, Iowa. Sure, people have gone to Iowa for the caucuses and everything, so we're no strangers to it. And this is a really easy way, Operation Swing State, easy way to try to help. Yeah, any conversations that you have are helpful, even just calling through the list. So yeah, that information can be shared again. And on June 28th, I'm really, really excited about this. It's going to be a virtual Zoom event with Congresswoman Underwood and Congressman Caston. HRC is endorsing them for their re-election as they were first elected in 2018. And we really want them to go back to DC. They're doing an incredible job. So they'll be speaking from 2 to 3, and then we'll have a following phone bank to try to help them out. So I really hope that you can be part of this. And I'm also volunteering for the political work in the area. So if you're interested in joining us, I'm happy to chat with you more.
Thanks. And for folks who want to be able to find these things after the presentation, we use Mobilize America to organize all of our events. So if you go to mobilize.us/HRC, you can find links to get involved with Operation Swing State. You can find the virtual forum. You can find all kinds of other things that we're running. Okay, that was so speedy. You only got one question. Are there other questions that you all have? Are there other things that I can help with or answer for you in this last little bit of our presentation? Sharina, did I get your answer for you? I hope I did. I'll speak a little bit more to it while we wait and see if there are other questions. What we do know about mail-in voting is that folks are engaging with mail-in voting, and the states are not as they're not as equipped to deal with mail-in voting. Folks who live in states that have switched to mail-in voting know that it took years to get good at it, and so both in the way that I was talking about with voter suppression, but also just with general issues around counting votes, mail-in voting is not the saving grace that we had hoped it would be, but it is our most important function for trying to change voting access. We have a whole host of voting access work that we're doing and things that we're working through, and so yeah, there will be more information to come from HRC about ways to engage with that work. In Illinois, there was just a bill that was passed that updated voting access and made things more open, and you live in a place that is honestly pretty great in terms of voting access. And so there are some gaps to close, but not very many. Illinois is a pretty good place. There are a number of other places that isn't true, including some of the places that we know will be battlegrounds. And what we saw in Georgia yesterday was so troubling. And so I think we all know that we have a lot more work to do. So my email is now on screen for you. It's lindsay.clark@hrc.org. I'm very, very happy to answer any questions that come up for you after this presentation. I'm so grateful that you were here, that you listened to my voice for so long. That's such a gift. And so I really appreciate your time. I hope that this was helpful for you all. Please keep it personal. And as you move forward in your work, don't forget that personal stories might not be your instinct, but they are your most important tool. And relational organizing isn't how we've done the work in the past, but honestly, it may be the only thing that will really, really work, especially this year. So take that, run with it, be your own heroes, be your own advocates. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference day. And again, thank you all so much for being here with us.
Thank you, everyone. I know it's been a great reminder for myself too.